Um, my name is Zachary Bugg. I'm a senior engineer at Kittleson and Associates. Welcome to the Fayetteville Area Multimodal Congestion Management Process Public Meeting number 1. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to the Executive Director of FAMPO, Mr. Hank Graham, who's going to share a few opening remarks and some acknowledgements.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So glad to see we have a decent amount of participation with this first session of public input for our congestion management process planning effort. I wanted to at least just welcome everyone. And of course, Zachary's done a wonderful job of preparing for this public input session. And Kittleson and Associates being our consultants working on this effort for us. They've done a wonderful job. I'm hoping we'll be able to receive a decent amount of public input and comments on this process. Wanted to just also mention or provide a special thanks to some local businesses that we utilize to distribute these public meeting notices. We have local Domino's Pizza and Dino's Pizza and Gusto Neapolitano Italian restaurant and pizzeria. We just placed advertisements of these meetings, this noonday session and this afternoon session on pizza boxes. So hopefully we'll be able to receive some public input from folks through that effort. Other than that, Zachary, I'll let you take it away and we'll get started.
Thank you, Hank. And again, thank you to those who have helped us spread the word about the public meeting. I wanted to do also just a quick acknowledgement of the rest of our team here. Our SNH and Creative Visibility are also with the Kittleson team here on the call and have provided quite a bit of support here preparing for this public meeting. Just a quick recap, you all have had a chance now to review the project website materials during the open house proportion of this meeting. This will be about a 30-minute presentation, and then we'll move on to question and answer for another 30 minutes. If you have questions, please drop them in the chat box at any time. We may have a chance to unmute and share questions here after the formal presentation. And the meeting is being recorded just for your information. It will be posted on the project website. This afternoon at 5:30, we will repeat the whole process. And if you've joined today, there will be no new information at the evening session. So no need to join again unless you just really would like to hear it all over again and participate again. But that session will be duplicative with this session. So I'll share a little bit about the project. We've made it through the existing conditions of the congestion management process. I'll be able to share our findings so far and have a chance for some discussion. So what is a congestion management process? It is undergone by metropolitan planning organizations of a certain size. They are federally required to provide this update to congestion management every 4 years. It's a comprehensive safety, mobility, and connectivity assessment for all transportation users. It encompasses the entire Fayetteville metropolitan area study organization and study area for that MPO limits. The purpose is to incorporate previous work, past studies, as well as new data for all modes of transportation. So as I mentioned, the study area includes the entire MPO limits, which is parts of Cumberland, Harnett, Hoke, and Rayford and Robeson counties. It includes all of the municipalities that you see here and the Cumberland County portion of Fort Bragg. So quite a large study area, over 250,000 people in population. It is really fundamental to provide a list of project goals and objectives when you embark on a large study like this. Some of the project goals are to enhance the multimodal transportation system, support performance measures that are federally mandated, as well as state through NCDOT and local through the Fayetteville Area Metropolitan Planning Organization, coordinating with all local stakeholders, including all of the municipalities within the MPO's limits, MPO staff, county staff, as well as NCDOT division staff. And then at the end of the day, we want to develop recommendations that are implementable within the NCDOT prioritization process. There is a pretty robust statewide funding mechanism through which all projects start at the local level, like in a plan like you see here, and are then scored through the statewide prioritization process where they compete with projects across the state. So it's very important to provide recommendations that score highly within that process so that they can be funded. How will the study address environmental justice? This has been a very high priority performance measure outlined by the MPO. Really, the idea is to provide equitable transportation solutions, facilitate a broad public outreach strategy and engagement. So that's what we have going on today, and then we'll be repeating throughout the project. We want to identify areas for improvements that are not just confined to one geographic or demographic area, but are really meant to enhance the livability of the MPO and to provide broad and diverse range of solutions. We want to contextualize the recommendations, prioritize those projects that don't harm the community and historic resources and actually improve connectivity and growth and development and the livability of those areas. A quick recap of our project schedule. We got started at the end of May, and it's approximately 12-month study that will wrap up around May of 2022. We've been working diligently on an existing conditions assessment to identify what areas there may be transportation deficiencies. And a big part of that is you all. We want to hear what we're missing in the data, where you may see those issues in transportation, no matter what mode it is, and where you'd like to see improvements. So that's where public engagement comes in. We want to know what are the gaps that we're missing. We'd like to inform you all of the data that we've provided, the data that we've looked into, but we want to hear your thoughts. And so that's the purpose of a lot of this meeting and that online presence. So you'll see there's a project website, congestionplan.com, that has all of the public meeting materials that you see here today, and we'll be posting the virtual meeting. It has a lot of interactive components, including maps and online comment maps and online survey. Going here into the online comment map, this is a very easy to use geographic way for you to leave your comments. So perhaps there's a portion of, let's say, Skybo Road where you see traffic congestion, or maybe there's a roadway like on Murchison Road where you are having issues crossing the street or would like to see additional sidewalk or trail infrastructure. It's very easy to use this map. You just point and double click, and then you'll be prompted to leave a comment, however you choose to provide that information. And then we'll be compiling all of that and putting it with the rest of the data to go into our report and then start to prioritize and implement solutions. There's also an online survey. It's about 18 questions and goes by pretty quick, about 10 minutes. It's really meant to facilitate a broad outreach and broad feedback loop here, so that you're able to tell us how frequently you travel throughout the MPO using each transportation mode, and then what are some of the deficiencies that you see for each mode. So, for example, what are your top 3 locations where you'd like to see more sidewalks or more crosswalks? So they're pretty simple questions. So moving on from that, I'd like to share just, we've done quite a bit of work, and we have a lot of information to share. I'll do my best to boil that down into a quick presentation here, but again, I'd like to refer you to the project website to view all of these maps in detail. The purpose of today's meeting is just to share the highlights of some of the deficiencies that we're seeing. And again, we're looking at every mode here, so driving, walking, transit, looking at environmental and land use data as well. So just starting with some demographic information, it's really helpful when we start looking at transit service, looking at biking, walking, and the propensity of providing that multimodal transportation, ridership, cycling and walking demand. It's really good to look at population density to look at what areas might have additional needs for those modes. One way is looking at the density of zero car households. So as you can see, there's pretty good preponderance of low vehicle ownership in the central areas of Fayetteville, but also in central Rayford. So there's some opportunities there to provide additional transit service to areas where there may be households without any vehicles, either folks that choose not to own a vehicle or folks that do not have a vehicle. So that is one area that we look at prioritizing those transportation improvements. Population density, I mentioned, is a great way to look at having additional multimodal transportation infrastructure. This should be not a whole lot of news to you all, but just to make you aware that we're providing this information in all of our data to help us prioritize those improvements. And then employment density, this would be outside of Fort Bragg. Fort Bragg, as you know, is the large employer within the MPO, but this is in addition to Fort Bragg's employment. There are some areas of the MPO limits that have pretty high employment density, and we would be focusing on some of those areas for a few of the transportation improvements. So all of that to say, we look at this demographic information from the U.S. Census Bureau to help identify areas where there might be a higher need for transit and cycling and walking modes along Murchison Road, Glennsford Drive, downtown, but also the veteran communities of Spring Lake and Rayford appear to have some higher propensity for those active transportation uses due to that demographic information. So switching gears a bit, I'd like to talk about the walking conditions throughout the MPO. And we've started using an assessment of all of the crash data that involved a pedestrian over the past 13, 14 years or so. And we've mapped all of it here. You can see there are a lot of green dots on this map. And as you can see, there are a few high-risk corridors where there's a lot of pedestrian demand, and also, unfortunately, there have been a lot of crashes involving pedestrians. So this would be step one of where we would look to help prioritize those improvements, whether it's additional sidewalk or trail facilities, improved crosswalks, improved intersections, just improving the safety of the intersection and looking at targeted improvements to help really help mitigate those crashes, so that we can really aim towards having very, very few. Also looking at sidewalk and trail coverage throughout the MPO. You can see here any green line is where there's an existing sidewalk. Any pink line is where there's a multi-use trail, like a cycling walking trail. And then blue lines on here is something that the MPO and the city have implemented that's kind of unique to the area, but these paved shoulders have been used. They're used for scooters, bicycling. They can be used as bus pullouts, but they are also used to supplement the sidewalk network. So we're looking at all of this to assess where might there be gaps, where might there be gaps in crosswalks, crossing major corridors, and then additional areas where there may not be a sidewalk today. Where are the opportunities to provide that additional sidewalk infrastructure? So in summary, there's pretty high coverage in downtown, but lacking in suburban areas. There are many major intersections that lack any marked crosswalks or pedestrian signal heads. Just providing a painted crosswalk also doesn't always do the trick. There may be additional treatments needed, such as median refuges, signalization, looking at raised crosswalks. There's a lot of tools in our toolbox for addressing crosswalk deficiencies. Some of the major corridors with high pedestrian crash frequency, we've listed the top 10 or so here. Again, if we're missing areas, we're really looking to hear from you all what might stand out on your typical commute, or if you're out for recreation. So moving on to bicycling, you'll see a lot of the similar themes. Areas that are not working as well for pedestrians, typically not working as well for cyclists either. But here's a map that NCDOT has compiled for all the bicyclists, all the crashes involving bicyclists in the past 13 to 14 years. As you can see, there are some other major study corridors that stand out. Also, some areas of downtown that have had some fairly high bicycle crash frequency. Another performance measure that we look at is called the bicycle level of traffic stress. This is a measure of just how comfortable it is to ride on a roadway. As you know, there are a lot of different levels of comfort and expertise when it comes to cyclists navigating the roadway network. These level of traffic stress thresholds are meant to stratify the bicycling network and the roadway network into what populations may be comfortable riding. So you start with level of traffic stress 1, which is comfortable for children, comfortable for those who are not experienced with cycling, all the way up to LTS 4, which is very uncomfortable or very hazardous for really any cyclist. So where you see red, the red and orange lines here are really those high stress, low comfort facilities where we may look at barriers in the cycling network, where we might want to look at improving connections across those corridors and lowering the level of traffic stress to a higher comfort level. So in summary, most of the urban streets in Fayetteville, we're talking very low volume grid system type streets. Most of those are good pockets of low stress bicycling facilities. The idea is to connect those with other pockets of ideal cycling conditions through trails and crosswalks and those types of facilities. I've listed here again the top 8 or 9 corridors by bicycle crash frequency, and these are where we would start for identifying those improvements later on in the project. Again, we want to hear from you if there are corridors that we're missing here, if there are specific locations that may require additional bicycling infrastructure or improvements. The next mode on our list of data is transit. And we started by providing a map of the existing fixed route bus service throughout the MPO. This is just one provider of transit. There are other on-demand providers that provide the populations within the MPO with transit service. But this is just a map of the FAST network through Fayetteville. So it services just within the city of Fayetteville limits. It serves most major corridors within the study area, but not all. Most of the routes, actually all but a few, are limited to a 60-minute headway. So we would want to hear from you if that is that's not frequent enough. If you're looking for more frequent service, if that would help you feel more inclined to use the transit system. If there are areas of the transit network that don't serve populations within the MPO, we would want to hear about that. Here's a few corridors here that are currently missing from the transit network. We want to hear from you if if there's a desire for additional transit service on these corridors outside the city limits or in other areas of the 4-county network here. Moving on to driving and automobile mode, we looked at the entire MPO, which is a large study area. Obviously, we're not going to look at every single intersection for a process like this. We've worked with the MPO staff and all of the project stakeholders to really boil down the analysis into 48 major study corridors within the project limits. And you can see all of those corridors in the project mapping information on the project website. We looked at a few different performance measures on those corridors. A lot of you are familiar with travel time. That's how long it takes you to get to work, or to get home, or to get to whatever destination that you're trying to get to. One thing that you may not think about as much is something called reliability. So we'll get into that as we move on through this data. We looked at delay, so that additional travel time that you encounter due to traffic congestion. We looked at hotspots along the corridors where there may be major intersections with really high delay and what we would call failing conditions. And then we also looked at a comprehensive crash data analysis, not just the pedestrian and bicycle modes that we shared earlier, but also any crash involving any type of vehicle. So really quickly, just identifying what is travel time reliability. Really all this boils down to is what's that additional planning time that you need to provide into your commute or into your travel time that may fluctuate from day to day. On Monday, you may leave for work and it'll take you 20 minutes, but on Wednesday, it may take you 30 minutes. So it's really looking at what's that reliability and how can you narrow that down to have a more reliable trip. So we've looked at that throughout the study network. Again, corridor delay is that extra travel time that you would encounter frequently, routinely due to traffic congestion during peak hours. So we have a few maps here. I've chosen to show just the afternoon peak hour, but we also looked at weekday morning peak hour. Afternoon is more interesting because there's more delay. And you can see here that when we look at reliability, the map here provides a different scale from less than 5% planning time over your typical travel time, all the way up to more than 20% over your typical travel time, having to account for that additional planning time in your commute. So you can see some of the major corridors here that are in that the worst of the worst. Skyborough Road, kind of going all the way down to Highway 59 through Hope Mills. There's some of these corridors are the least reliable, and that's kind of what would rise to the top of looking at transportation improvements. Similarly, when you look at delay, we actually boiled this down to delay on a per mile basis to be able to provide comparison of differing corridors by length. You can see here the US 401, Ramsey Street, Rayford Road. These are some of the corridors with the highest delays. Over a minute per vehicle per mile really adds up along a pretty long corridor. So as you would think, some of these corridors coming into town from Spring Lake and up from Hope Mills, these are the worst corridors in terms of delay. We looked at intersections on a point-by-point basis to look at where might there be the worst level of service. We use a term called level of service to really assign a letter grade to each intersection based on how much time people are spending waiting at the intersection due to traffic congestion. And it's really that level of service E and the level of service F that we would be looking at for the worst conditions. Everything else we looked at is what's called level of service D or better, and those are not going to be prioritized to the highest unless there's something that we're missing, which is what we want to hear from you. If some of these other intersections seem like they should be LOSF instead of D, we want to hear that from you and see if there might be something to refine the data. So you can see here a lot of the major intersections along Cliffdale Road, standing out. Also MacArthur, some of the other major corridors within the study area, having those hotspots and this high level of service. Finally, we looked at crash data throughout the MPO and just we identified each of the intersections with more than 50 crashes within the last 5 years. This is just looking at those high frequency locations where there might be high volume, but also just a lot of crashes. So this is another performance measure that we use when ranking these corridors. All right, so just looking at the top 10 to 15 corridors, looking at delay, reliability, crash data, hotspots. These are the ones that stand out to us that we would be moving forward to identify project alternatives and solutions to prioritize through the NCDOT process. If you feel like there's a corridor that's missing from this list, or if you would like to provide feedback on any of these corridors where there may be some conditions that we're missing, we'd really welcome that through the online survey, through your comments here, or any other way that you would like to provide feedback on that. We'll be compiling that and putting into our data before we start to prioritize those improvements. So in summary, I'd just like to kind of wrap up here what we have done to date. We looked at 48 major corridors throughout the MPO. We also looked at those from many different modes, perspective of someone who is walking, someone who may be cycling or taking transit, and then finally taking a passenger car. Looking at multimodal safety deficiencies, looking at congestion, also assessing key gaps when it comes to connectivity, looking at transit service gaps where there might be additional ridership or propensity for additional ridership. And we boiled all that down into a list of deficient corridors and deficient areas. And our hope is to supplement that with feedback from you all through this public meeting, and then also through the online survey and comment map. So in terms of next steps for the project, we have about 8 months left in our project timeline, moving into the end of next spring. We will be completing an existing conditions booklet after incorporating feedback from these 2 public meetings today. That will include all of the mapping that we've shown here and posted on the project website. After completing that existing conditions booklet, we will be moving into the future traffic assessment, forecasting traffic volumes about 20 years into the future, and updating all of our data to look at where is something failing now and it's going to get worse, or where is something maybe not a problem now, but it could be after growth in traffic volume. And then identifying those future transportation deficiencies, looking at recommendations for each of those corridors. Maybe it's widening a road, maybe it's taking a road down and making it a road diet, like some of the other areas have done in this MPO, looking at improving conditions for biking and walking, looking at improving intersections, crosswalks, where might there be additional connectivity needs, so on and so forth. Looking at all of those when we pull out all of our tools in our toolbox to propose these recommendations. After we go through that process, we will have another touch point with you all, the public, around March 2022. We're hoping to finish all of our future conditions assessment and develop those preliminary alternatives by next March, and then share that with you all, provide another feedback loop before we wrap up the project. So please stay tuned there. Please provide your feedback. I'll do one more call here on this last slide to visit our project website and provide your feedback